I selected this topic because monetary rewards, it turns out, have been getting quite a bit of bad press lately. Alfie Kohn is one of the most outspoken critics of monetary incentives. And he had a recent New York Times opinion article in which he proclaims science has confirmed that monetary rewards amount to bribes that don't work. So that's a pretty strong claim, and it's a little bit hard. It's hard to buy that claim given that we see monetary rewards being used in business organizations, pretty extensively. And it's also stirred up quite a bit of controversy within the business community. In fact, you'll see some debates in the Harvard Business Review about the ideas that Alfie Kohn has put forth. So one of the questions that I want us to think about today is whether or not science really has confirmed this. And it turns out it's not quite so clear, and it's a little more nuanced than that. So I'm excited to share with you some of the research and some of the things that we do know about monetary rewards and when and if they work, and a little bit on how to design those rewards. So let's start with this concept, Homoeconomicus. It's Latin for economic human. Now, I didn't make up this term. It's used quite extensively in the economics field. But it describes a model of human behavior that's very rational, and very rational in sort of an economic sense. So here's an example. Let's say you're hungry and you fancy an apple at a fruit stand. And so you go to the grocery store and there's 3 different options for apples. There's one that's 35 cents, one that's 40 cents, and one that's 45 cents. Which would you buy? Now, these all look exactly alike, and they are in fact identical. And so this is not a trick question. Obviously, you would buy the 35 cent if these are truly all identical. And that's a very Homoeconomicus way to respond to that particular question, because you would be acting in your own rational self-interest. You know what you want. You can judge the utility, and utility, by the way, is an economist's word that just means how much you value it or how happy you are. And usually we think about utility in a monetary sense. So, how much wealth you get from that particular decision. And you're also going to act very selfishly and rationally to maximize your utility. So that's a very simple example that just shows the rational thinking of somebody who's behaving in a way that Homo economicus would predict. So what makes us abnormal? We have limitations in our ability to solve problems. So a quote from a few minutes ago, Homo economicus, unswervingly rational, completely selfish, and can effortlessly solve even the most difficult optimization problem. Well, it turns out we're not all like that, at least not all the time. There's a new book out by Richard Thaler called Nudge, and some of you might be familiar with this book as well. And they say, unlike members of Homo economicus, members of Homo sapiens, that's you and me, make predictable mistakes. So that's where this predictable irrationality idea comes from. Because we use heuristics and fall prey to fallacies, and because the way we're influenced by our social interactions. So Richard Thaler is pretty famous for introducing some of these ideas into economics discipline. In fact, he won the 2017 Nobel Prize for Economics for his contributions to behavioral economics. And this headline I particularly like: Richard Thaler wins the Nobel in Economics for killing Homo economicus. And I would say maybe discovering abnormal. So this is very much sort of being brought into our business disciplines and the economics, and really recognizing that people behave in a way that's not always completely rational. This is a wheel of, I guess, abnormal behavior. You can think of it like that. Now, I realize you can't read the text on this, but the point of this is that we exhibit a lot of irrational decision-making behavior. And this has been documented across many years of research and in many different settings. And there's just a number of different things that we do that cause us to deviate from what I would say Homo economicus behavior and to portray abnormal behavior. Sometimes we just have too much information and we can't process it all. And one thing we see people doing is engaging in what we call anchoring. So here, a famous example of the anchoring phenomenon is Tversky and Kahneman. Again, they set up an experiment where they had the participants spin a roulette wheel. Now, they kind of tricked the participants because they were predetermined to stop at either the number 10 or the number 65. And then they asked the participants, what percentage of the United Nations are African nations? And what's interesting is those whose wheel stopped at 10 guessed that on average 25% of the United Nations was from African nations. Those whose wheel stopped at 65 guessed that 45% of the United Nations represented African nations. Now, clearly, the roulette wheel had nothing at all to do with the makeup of the United Nations. And so what they were documenting is a tendency just to anchor on numbers, and it can influence our judgments and decision-making without us even realizing it. So it's interesting to think about how this might affect business decisions. You can imagine how this might play out in the workplace in making, for example, investment decisions, assessing different investment decisions, or in a performance evaluation. Another tendency we see is what we call a halo effect. And so we tend to take one characteristic of, say, an individual and sort of expand it and let it spill over and affect our judgments about other characteristics. So, for example, if I think you're attractive, I also think you're smart. So again, this can have important implications for performance evaluation. And we've already seen the idea of this mental accounting. I've shown you an example of that. There's also what we call the Lake Wobegon effect. Some of you may remember Garrison Keillor's Prairie Home Companion. And Lake Wobegon was his mystical town where all the women were strong, all the men were good looking, and all the children were above average. So this idea, all the children are above average, that actually is a thing. People tend to sort of make that fallacy, make that mistake. And then last one is loss aversion. And we're actually going to talk about that one in a few minutes. So this takes us back to this idea of what about monetary incentives? You know, when do monetary incentives work in the workplace? Are they effective or do they not? And one of the things that's important to remember is that unlike Homoeconomicus, we people, real people, value things other than money. We value reciprocity and fairness. We value social norms. We want to conform to social norms. Trust is important to us, and trust in others and being seen as trustworthy. These are things that matter to us that likely wouldn't matter to Homo economicus. This begs a question, given that we're abnormal, how effective are monetary incentives in the workplace? So if you think about it, what we want are employees to exert effort, and in doing so, they're going to improve their performance, and then we're going to reward them, and then they in turn will exhibit more effort. So this is the idea of monetary incentives. But people don't value just money. People value things other than money. So this is going to play into the decision and to the effectiveness of monetary incentives. Now, it turns out, contrary to what Alfie Kohn has presented, there are many examples of effective pay-for-performance systems or monetary rewards. Let me give you a little bit of history of some of these. Nordstrom, everybody's familiar with Nordstrom. In the 1980s, Nordstrom was the first retail organization to begin paying commissions. And it was met with huge success. They had the highest sales productivity in the industry. They had 2 times the industry average of sales per square foot. They had the highest perceived customer service. They had the highest paid employees. There were shoe salesmen making upwards of $80,000 a year. This was back in the 1980s. They had 23% sales growth, 22% earnings growth. So certainly monetary incentives had a huge impact on that organization. There's quite a bit of academic research examining whether or not monetary rewards work. In the academic research, there's a number of industry studies where they look at industries or organizations to really document whether or not there's performance improvements. And what we see is, we tend to see performance improvements when companies start providing monetary rewards. This graph on the right is from a 1996 study where they simply instituted a bonus plan for their sales force. Before the red line is prior to the bonus plan being implemented. After the red line are the incremental sales after the incentives were put into place. And so very clearly it improved the financial performance and the sales performance of that particular company's workforce. A later study with that same company, they removed the sales incentive plan, and this is not shown here, but the sales performance actually went back down. So we see many examples in the academic research about rewards, monetary rewards having a positive impact on performance. So at the end of the day, contrary to what Alfie Kohn suggests, science is far from conclusive on the effectiveness of monetary rewards. It really does depend on the situation and the setting. And in reality, it's much more nuanced than Alfie Kohn suggests, and of course, challenging, which makes all of our jobs, I guess, a little more difficult, but also a little more interesting.